We now have new information that the official autopsy in the death of Nolan Wells has been completed.
Nolan Wells' autopsy results have been completed. That's the update we have for you right now, and it's a big one because for weeks, this family has been waiting for exactly this moment. Here's what we know. As of this weekend, officials familiar with the investigation confirmed the state's official autopsy is done. But, and this is important, the results themselves have not been made public yet. They're headed somewhere first, a grand jury. So before we go any further, let's be clear about what's confirmed and what isn't. Confirmed, the state autopsy is complete. Not yet public, what it actually says. And separately, already public but incomplete, the family's own independent autopsy, which raised more questions than it answered. Two timelines. And only one of them has spoken yet. We're going to walk through both of them right now, what the state has, what the family found on their own, and why the gap between those two reports might be the most important thing in this entire case. Let's start with what the state actually has. According to officials familiar with the investigation, the medical examiner's office has completed its autopsy on Nolan Wells. That's confirmed. What comes next is the part that matters most right now. Those findings are expected to be sent to a grand jury, not to a press conference, not to a public statement, to a grand jury. And if you're watching this and thinking, why does it take this long and why does it go there first instead of just being announced? That's a fair question and it's one we put directly to civil rights attorney Adante Pointer. Here's his explanation. The state had custody of Nolan's body before anyone else did. Before the family, before an independent examiner, before any outside party had access. That matters because it means the state's medical examiner was working with the body in its most original, most intact condition. They had first opportunity, and really the primary duty, to examine it for any signs of trauma, drowning, other physical injury, and to run toxicology to check for alcohol or other substances. That's the state's advantage in this process. It's also, according to Pointer, part of why it takes so long. State autopsies typically move slower than independent ones and the family, any family in this position, is left waiting, anxious, wanting answers about their son and instead being told, not yet. There's also a reason officials aren't saying more right now. Pointer is direct about this. Authorities are intentionally tight-lipped in investigations like this one. Not because they're hiding something and not because they're being evasive, but because talking early can tip off witnesses, tip off potential suspects, or compromise the integrity of everything they're building toward that grand jury. It's a protective silence, not a suspicious one. That distinction matters because in a case like this, it's easy to read silence as guilt, when very often it's just protocol. So that's thread one. The state has finished its work. It's headed to a grand jury. And officials are staying quiet, for now, for reasons that have more to do with protecting the process than protecting anyone in it. But while the state has been working, the family hasn't been sitting still. And what they found on their own is where this story gets a lot more complicated. Here's a phrase you may have already seen if you've been following this case. Cause and manner of death, undetermined, pending investigation. That's the language from the family's independent autopsy, the one they pursued on their own, separate from the state. And on its surface, undetermined, can sound almost like nothing. Like a shrug. Like the examiner just didn't find anything. That is not what it means here. And it's worth slowing down on exactly why. According to Pointer, the independent examiner was not able to reach a final conclusion, not because there wasn't enough to look at, but because critical parts of Nolan's body were missing by the time that independent exam took place. Specifically, his larynx and his throat. Why does that matter so much? Because the throat and larynx are exactly where a forensic examiner would look for evidence of choking or asphyxiation. Without them you cannot rule that in. And you also cannot rule it out. That absence doesn't point to an answer. It removes the ability to get one, at least from that exam. Remember, drowning was the initial working theory here. That's what officials suspected, at least early on, and that's the story that first circulated. But a working theory is not a finding. And without the ability to examine the throat, the independent examiner couldn't confirm drowning, couldn't confirm asphyxiation, and couldn't rule out anything in between. So let's be precise about what we actually know at this point and what we don't. Confirmed, Nolan Wells' body was recovered days after he went missing near Horn Island. Confirmed, the independent autopsy was incomplete, specifically missing the throat and larynx. Confirmed, because of that, the independent examiner could not determine cause of death. Not confirmed, what actually killed him. Drowning remains a theory, the one initially suspected, but it is not an established, confirmed finding. Not from the independent exam and not yet from the state. That's the gap this case is currently sitting in. One report that's finished but not yet public. One report that's public but incomplete. And a family in the middle of both, still without the answer they need most. Next, we're going to look at what witnesses on Horn Island saw in Nolan's final hours, and one detail about his phone that even his own attorney says doesn't add up. Now let's talk about Nolan's final hours, because this is where new video is starting to shift the picture. TMZ, our partners here at Fox, obtained footage from Horn Island showing Nolan Wells in the moments before he was last seen. In the video, he's on multiple boats, surrounded by a group of people. He's not alone out there. He's with friends in what looks like an ordinary day on the water. And then, according to those friends, the day took a turn. Their account is that they sailed back without him, that they left Nolan behind on Horn Island and he stayed. That's the story that's been told so far. Nolan chose to stay. His friends went home. Here's the detail that doesn't sit right, and it's not us saying that. It's his own family's attorney. Nolan's phone made it back to Mississippi. Back to land. Back with his friends. He did not. Think about that for a second. If someone is planning to stay behind, intentionally on their own, how often does that person leave their phone with the group that's leaving? Pointer put it plainly, that's an odd factor. In this day and age, especially for someone Nolan's age, people are attached to their phones. Being separated from it while consciously choosing to stay somewhere else doesn't line up cleanly with the story as it's been told. That doesn't mean the friend's account is false. But it does mean there's a gap in it, a detail that needs explaining and hasn't been yet. And that's really the shift happening in this case right now. This was never just a question of how Nolan Wells died. Increasingly, it's a question of what happened before he was left. What was his mental state? Was there any kind of disagreement, any tension within the group in those final hours on the island? Witness accounts, every single person who saw Nolan that day, whether right before his friends left or any point after, are going to be critical to reconstructing that timeline. Not just to confirm the broad strokes of the story, but to either support or contradict the specific details, like why a phone that should have stayed with him didn't. That's the real mystery investigators are chasing right now. Not just the water. The hours before it. Which brings us to something else moving in the background of this case. The phones themselves. Nolan's family, through their legal team, is actively pursuing phone records from people who were present on Horn Island that day. And according to Pointer, this isn't a minor detail. This could end up being some of the most important evidence in the entire case. Here's why. A phone is essentially a digital footprint. Every location it's been carries GPS data attached to it, which means investigators can reconstruct where specific people were at specific times on that island. That's not speculation, that's data. And beyond location, there's communication. Text messages sent that day before Nolan was left, after he was left. Any of it could reference him directly or reference what was happening in that group. Put together, that's enough to start rebuilding an actual timeline of the day. Not friends' memories months later. An actual, reconstructed sequence of where people were and what they were saying to each other. And here's the part that matters for anyone who was out there that day. This evidence doesn't just point in one direction. Pointer was clear about that. Digital records can implicate someone, but they can just as easily rule someone out. If your phone shows you weren't near a certain part of the island, or your messages show nothing relevant to what happened, that clears you. This isn't a fishing expedition aimed at any one person. It's a process that's supposed to sort out who was actually involved in whatever happened to Nolan Wells, and who wasn't. One more thing worth knowing, because it comes up in almost every case like this. People sometimes assume that deleting a message makes it disappear. It doesn't. Investigators are often able to retrieve data that's been deleted from a device. So if there is anything relevant sitting on any of these phones, deleted or not, there's a real chance it doesn't stay hidden. To be clear about where things actually stand, none of this is confirmed evidence yet. No records have been made public. No timeline has been officially released. What we know is that the effort to obtain this evidence is underway, and that it's considered a serious, credible avenue in this investigation. Not speculation, but an active part of building out what actually happened. So that's where we are. A completed state autopsy not yet public. A family autopsy that couldn't reach a conclusion. New video raising new questions about Nolan's final hours. And a digital trail that investigators are only just beginning to pull on. Next, we'll walk through everything that's happening in parallel right now, every process still moving in this case, so you have the full picture of where things stand. Let's pull back for a second, because there's a lot moving in this case at once, and it's worth laying it all out clearly so nothing gets lost in the shuffle. First, the state autopsy. Completed as of this weekend. not yet public. Headed to a grand jury, where its findings will actually be reviewed before, presumably, the public ever sees them in full. Second, the independent autopsy, the one the family pursued on their own. That one is already public, but as we walked through, it couldn't reach a conclusion. Cause and manner of death, undetermined, pending investigation, largely because the throat and larynx were missing from the body by the time that exam took place. Third, the digital side of this. Nolan's family, through their legal team, is actively working to obtain phone records from people who were present on Horn Island. That process is underway right now. Nothing from it has been made public. But according to Pointer, it's one of the more promising paths toward actually reconstructing what happened in Nolan's final hours, because unlike memory, unlike friends' accounts told after the fact, phone data doesn't shift with retelling. Fourth, witness interviews. Still ongoing. And Pointer was direct about why these matter so much. Witnesses have first-hand knowledge of what actually took place, who was involved, and how the day unfolded. Every account, whether from someone who saw Nolan right before his friends left, or anyone who crossed paths with him at any point that day, adds another piece. And just as importantly, those accounts can be used to check other accounts, to see where stories line up and where they don't. So 4 processes all moving in parallel. A finished autopsy waiting on a grand jury, an inconclusive independent autopsy already public, a digital evidence effort just getting underway, and a witness interview process still active. Now, in a story like this, you'd normally want more than one outside perspective weighing in. Someone to push back, someone to offer a different read on where things stand. In this case, we only have one. Attorney Adante Pointer, who's been walking us through the legal and investigative side of this all along. We're not going to manufacture a second opinion just to have one. What we have is his read, grounded in what's actually known, and we're going to stay with that until there's more voices with something substantive to add. If you're asking what actually moves this case forward from here, it's not another statement and it's not another headline. It's the grand jury. What they're shown, what the state has actually gathered behind the scenes, and whether that's enough to answer the question this family has been asking since early July. What happened to their son? Before we close, one thing we want to be upfront about. In cases like this, misinformation tends to spread fast. False claims, secondhand rumors treated as fact. We don't have anything specific from this reporting to correct on that front today, and we're not going to pretend otherwise just to fill space. If and when there's something worth correcting, we'll bring it to you directly, sourced and verified. Until then, we'd rather tell you what we don't know than guess. Let's end where this story actually lives. Not in the legal process, not in the evidence, but with the family. Nolan Wells was 18 years old. Pointer's words on this stuck with us. An 18-year-old healthy young man who had all the promise and his whole life in front of him. And now his family is left with what Pointer called a void. Not an answer. Not closure. A void. There's a tension running underneath all of this that's worth sitting with. The state, for its part, is staying quiet, and as we discussed, that silence largely comes from a protective place, meant to preserve the integrity of the investigation. But for a family living through this, that same silence feels like something else entirely. Pointer put it about as plainly as it can be put. What a family wants in this position isn't discretion. It's transparency. And they don't want it eventually, in his words, they want it like yesterday. Both of those things are true at once. Investigators have real reasons to hold back. And a mother and father have real reasons to be desperate for anything at all. So here's where this stands, pulled all the way together. The state has finished its autopsy, and it's headed to a grand jury, the next real milestone in this case. The family's independent autopsy came back undetermined, incomplete without the throat and larynx needed to rule choking or asphyxiation in or out. New video is raising real questions about Nolan's final hours on Horn Island, particularly around a phone that made it home without him. And a digital and witness-based effort to reconstruct that day is now actively underway. What we don't have as of tonight, the actual cause of death. A public state autopsy report. Or a clear account of exactly what happened between Nolan and the group he was with before he was left behind. We want to be honest about something else too. We don't have a funeral date. We don't have a vigil or a location or any of the details that usually accompany a moment like this. And rather than guess at them or attach a moment to this story that we can't confirm, we're simply not going to include one. If and when that information becomes available and it's something we can verify, we'll bring it to you. What we can tell you is that this story isn't close to over. There's a grand jury process still to come. There's digital evidence still being gathered. There are witnesses still being interviewed. And there's a family who, as of tonight, still doesn't have the answer they've been asking for since the beginning of July. We're going to stay on this story. We're going to keep talking to the people close to it like Adante Pointer, who's already told us he plans to keep working this case alongside us. And we're going to bring you the facts as we actually get them verified and not a moment before. Thank you so much for being with us tonight. If you want to stay with this story as it develops, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next update the moment we have one. We'll see you next time.